The sun was setting over Los Angeles as John Miller settled into his favorite armchair. His small apartment felt cozy tonight. John reached for the remote control and turned on his television. He was looking forward to tonight's episode of Celebrity Showdown. The show was famous for bringing together big stars who did not always get along. Tonight was special. Two of the biggest names in Hollywood would face each other, Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. John had read about the growing tension between these two film legends in the past few months. It had started when Robert De Niro gave an interview to Film Quarterly magazine. In that interview, De Niro had made some sharp comments about Eastwood's way of directing movies. He called Eastwood's style too simple and lacking depth. These words had not gone over well with Eastwood fans. Since then, the two men had not spoken to each other in public. "This is going to be good," John said to himself as he opened a bag of chips. He was not alone in his excitement. Across America, millions of viewers were tuning in, hoping to witness a memorable moment between the two actors. The show began with its usual flashy opening. Bright lights swept across the studio as the theme music played. The host of Celebrity Showdown, Susan Gray, walked onto the stage with a big smile. Susan had been hosting the show for 5 years. She had a talent for getting stars to speak openly about difficult topics. "Good evening, America," Susan said to the camera. "Tonight, we have a very special show for you. Two men who have defined American cinema for decades will share our stage. Please welcome Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro." The studio audience stood up and clapped loudly as the two men walked onto the stage from opposite sides. Clint Eastwood moved with the same calm, steady walk that had made him famous in his Western movies. He wore a simple gray suit with no tie. His face showed little emotion as he nodded to the audience. Robert De Niro came out with more energy. He smiled and waved to the crowd. He wore a dark blue suit with a red tie. The difference in their entrances seemed to highlight the contrast between these two Hollywood giants. In the front row of the audience sat Mary Johnson and Frank Peters, two well-known film critics. Mary leaned over to Frank and whispered, "Look at how they won't even look at each other. This is going to be interesting." Frank nodded. "Susan is going to have her hands full tonight." Susan guided the two actors to their seats. Two large, comfortable chairs faced each other with Susan's chair positioned between them. The stage lights made the tension between the men even more clear. Eastwood sat straight in his chair, his face calm and still. De Niro crossed his legs and adjusted his tie, seeming less at ease. "Gentlemen, thank you both for coming tonight," Susan began. "I think everyone here knows that you two haven't exactly seen eye to eye lately." De Niro gave a small laugh. "That's putting it mildly, Susan." Eastwood simply nodded, his face still not showing much emotion. Behind the cameras, the show's producer, Alan White, watched carefully. This was exactly the kind of television moment he had hoped for when he had first tried to get these two actors on the show. It had taken months of calls and promises to make it happen. Alan turned to his assistant, Betty Rogers, and whispered, "Make sure we get every reaction shot. I want to see both their faces when the other is speaking." Susan started with some easy questions about their recent work. She asked Eastwood about his newest film, a drama about a retired horse trainer. Then she asked De Niro about his role in a new crime movie. Both men answered politely, speaking about their work with the passion that had made them legends in Hollywood. The audience listened closely, but everyone was waiting for Susan to bring up the real reason they were all there. After about 15 minutes, Susan finally said, "Robert, a few months ago, you made some comments about Clint's directing style. That got a lot of attention. Would you like to explain what you meant?" The studio became very quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath. In the control room, the director, Pete Adams, quickly told his team to zoom in on De Niro's face. De Niro shifted in his seat. "Look, Susan, I have great respect for Clint's body of work. No one can deny his place in film history. But," Susan prompted, "but I think as artists we should always push boundaries. Some directors, and I'm not pointing fingers here, seem to take a more, let's say, simple approach. I believe in digging deeper, in really exploring the complexity of human emotions." The camera moved to Eastwood, who remained still, his eyes fixed on De Niro. The only sign that he had heard the comment was a slight tightening around his mouth. In the audience, a young film student named Lisa Brown whispered to her boyfriend, "He's basically calling Eastwood shallow again, just in nicer words." Susan turned to Eastwood. "Clint, how do you respond to that?" Before Eastwood could answer, De Niro continued, "And let me add something about political responsibility too. As artists, we have a platform. We can't just stay silent about important issues facing our country. Some people prefer to keep quiet or support policies that I think are harmful." Now the conversation had moved beyond film to politics, a subject where the two men were known to have very different views. Eastwood had once spoken at a Republican convention, while De Niro had been openly critical of conservative politicians. Backstage, Debbie Clark, a production assistant, stopped checking her clipboard and stared at the monitor. "This is getting intense," she said to another crew member. Susan, sensing that the conversation might get too heated, tried to steer it back. "Clint, you've had a long career both as an actor and director. How would you describe your approach to filmmaking?" Eastwood took a moment before answering. When he spoke, his voice had that familiar, raspy quality that fans loved. "I believe in letting the story speak for itself. Too many words can get in the way of a good story." Some people in the audience nodded in agreement. De Niro leaned forward. "But sometimes stories need to be told in a way that challenges the audience, that makes them uncomfortable. That's how change happens." Susan noticed that Eastwood's eyes had narrowed slightly. She knew from her research that he did not like being interrupted. The tension in the room was growing by the second. In the control room, Alan White was smiling. "This is gold," he said to no one in particular. "Ratings are going to be through the roof." As the first commercial break approached, Susan said, "When we come back, we'll dive deeper into these different approaches to filmmaking and maybe even discuss that political comment that Robert just made. Stay with us." As the cameras stopped rolling for the break, Eastwood and De Niro sat in silence, neither looking at the other. The crew rushed around, adjusting lights and checking microphones. Susan took a sip of water and looked at her notes. She knew that what would happen after the break could become one of the most talked about moments in the show's history. The real confrontation was yet to come. The red lights on the cameras turned back on as Celebrity Showdown returned from the commercial break. The audience settled back into their seats. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Susan Gray smiled at the camera with the polished ease of a host who knew exactly what she was doing. "Welcome back to Celebrity Showdown. We're here with Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro, two of the biggest names in Hollywood history." During the break, makeup artists had rushed to touch up both men. The studio had grown warmer with all the lights and the full audience. A thin layer of sweat had formed on De Niro's forehead, which the makeup artist quickly fixed. Eastwood had barely moved during the break. He had declined the offer for a touch-up with a small wave of his hand. Susan turned to face Eastwood directly. "Clint, before the break, Robert was talking about how he believes artists should use their platform to speak out on political issues. You've had a different approach throughout your career. Could you share your thoughts on that?" The camera zoomed in on Eastwood's face. At 94 years old, his face showed the lines of a long life lived under the public eye. Yet his eyes remained sharp and clear. "I've always believed that my work should speak for itself," Eastwood said in his low, gravelly voice. "I make films that ask questions. I don't like to tell people what to think." De Niro shifted in his seat. It was clear he wanted to respond. Susan, sensing this, nodded to him. "Robert?" "With all due respect, Clint," De Niro began, leaning forward in his chair. "These are not normal times we're living in. Sometimes being quiet is the same as taking a side. When we see things happening in our country that go against basic human values, I think we have a duty to speak up." In the control room, Alan White watched the monitors with growing excitement. "Camera 3, stay on Eastwood. I want to see his reaction," he said into his headset. The camera caught a slight tightening around Eastwood's eyes, but his expression remained calm. And who decides what these basic human values are, Robert? He asked. That's the problem with Hollywood sometimes. Some folks think everyone should think the same way they do. A few people in the audience clapped at this comment. Others looked uncomfortable. Susan noticed the split reaction and decided to push further. Robert, you've been very open about your political views throughout your career. Has that ever hurt you professionally? De Niro laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Probably, but I can't worry about that. There are more important things than getting every job or being liked by everyone. Some issues are worth fighting for, even if it costs you. As De Niro spoke, his voice grew more passionate. His hands moved in the air to emphasize his points. I think artists have a responsibility. We can't just sit back and pretend that what happens in Washington doesn't affect us. Some people in our industry prefer to stay silent or support policies that hurt real people. I can't do that. I won't do that. The camera caught Susan's eyes widening slightly. De Niro was clearly referring to Eastwood's past political support for conservative causes, though he hadn't named him directly. In the audience, Joe Martinez, a longtime fan of both actors, whispered to his wife Karen, "This is getting personal now. Look at Eastwood's face." Indeed, Eastwood's expression had changed. There was a slight hardness around his mouth now. Everyone in the studio could feel the tension building. This was exactly the kind of moment that made Celebrity Showdown one of the highest-rated talk shows on television. Susan decided to directly address the tension. It seems like you two have very different views on the role of celebrities in political discourse. Clint, do you feel that Robert's approach is too outspoken? Before Eastwood could answer, De Niro continued. Look, we all have to live with ourselves. At the end of the day, I sleep better knowing I stood up for what I believe in. Some people prefer to stay quiet, or worse, support harmful policies because it's better for their career or their wallet. Now the reference to Eastwood was impossible to miss. A few gasps came from the audience. In the front row, film critic Frank Peters leaned over to Mary Johnson and whispered, "He's really going after him now." Backstage, producer Alan White was practically bouncing with excitement. He turned to his assistant Betty Rogers and said, "This is exactly what we wanted. This is going to be everywhere tomorrow." Susan Gray, sensing that things might be getting too heated, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Let's talk about your different approaches to acting. Clint, you're known for your economy of expression, while Robert is famous for his intense preparation and transformation into characters. How do these different methods affect your work?" But De Niro wasn't ready to change the subject. "Before we move on, Susan, I want to be clear about something. When artists with influence stay silent about injustice or worse, support policies that hurt vulnerable people, they become part of the problem. That's my view, and I stand by it." Now all eyes turned to Eastwood. The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera operators held perfectly still. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. How would the legendary Clint Eastwood respond to this clear challenge? Eastwood took his time. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back, up at De Niro. His face revealed little, but there was a certain intensity in his gaze now. Susan waited, not wanting to interrupt what could be a defining moment of the show. The silence stretched for what felt like a long time but was actually only a few seconds. Finally, Eastwood spoke. "You know, Robert, I've been in this business for over 60 years now. I've seen a lot of changes. I've seen a lot of actors come and go. One thing I've noticed is that the ones who shout the loudest aren't always the ones with the most to say." His words were measured, his tone even. But there was no mistaking the challenge in them. De Niro's face flushed slightly. In the audience, Nicole Adams grabbed her husband Paul's arm. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He just shut him down without even raising his voice." Susan sensed that this exchange was heading toward the climax everyone had been anticipating. She needed to give Eastwood space to continue. "What do you mean by that, Clint?" she asked. Eastwood sat up a bit straighter in his chair. His eyes never left De Niro's face. "I mean that real conviction doesn't need to be announced at every opportunity. Sometimes it's the quiet actions that speak the loudest." De Niro's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Susan cut in. "We'll get your response after this short break, Robert. Don't go anywhere, folks. This conversation is just getting started." As the cameras cut away for the commercial, the tension on stage remained. De Niro leaned back in his chair, his face showing a mix of frustration and thought. Eastwood remained still, his expression unreadable. The stage crew moved around them, careful not to get between the two Hollywood legends. Susan looked at her notes, knowing that when they returned from the break, she would need to manage what could become one of the most memorable confrontations in television history. The stage was set for Eastwood's crushing one-liner that would change everything. The bright red light on the main camera turned on again as Celebrity Showdown returned from its commercial break. The studio audience seemed to sit up straighter in their seats. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen. The show's theme music faded out, and Susan Gray faced the camera with a serious expression. "Welcome back to Celebrity Showdown. We're continuing our conversation with Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. Before the break, things were getting quite heated. The camera panned to show both men. De Niro was sitting forward in his chair, one hand resting on his knee. He looked, ready to speak. Eastwood remained in the same position he had been in before the break, his back straight, his face calm but alert. Susan turned to De Niro. "Robert, Clint suggested that the loudest voices aren't always the ones with the most to say. You seem to have a strong reaction to that. Would you like to respond?" De Niro nodded. "Yes, I would. Look, I respect Clint as a filmmaker and actor. No one can deny his talent or his impact on our industry. But I disagree strongly with this idea that speaking up loudly about important issues is somehow less valuable than staying quiet." He leaned forward even more, his eyes intense. "When I see children in cages, when I see rights being taken away from people, when I see hatred being encouraged from the highest levels of power, I can't stay quiet, and I don't think anyone should." The control room. Alan White smiled and whispered to his assistant, "He's going all in now." Susan nodded thoughtfully. "Clint, would you like to respond to that?" All eyes turned to Eastwood. The studio was completely silent. Even the usual small sounds of a TV set, people shifting in their seats, papers rustling, the quiet hum of equipment, seemed to stop. It was as if everyone was holding their breath. Eastwood took his time. He looked directly at De Niro for a long moment. Then he slowly leaned forward in his chair. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, forcing everyone to listen carefully. "You know, Robert," Eastwood began, his voice carrying that familiar raspy quality that had become his trademark in countless films. "In all my years in this business, I've learned one thing." He paused, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. De Niro looked directly at him, waiting. Susan didn't dare interrupt. The loudest person in the room isn't necessarily the one with the most to say. The simplicity of the statement, delivered with Eastwood's characteristic quiet intensity, sent shockwaves through the studio. The camera caught Susan Gray's eyes widening slightly. In the audience, Nicole Adams gasped audibly while her husband, Paul, reached for her hand. De Niro, known for his quick responses, found himself momentarily speechless. The camera lingered on his face as he processed Eastwood's words. His expression shifted from surprise to something harder to read, perhaps a mixture of respect and frustration. The line hung in the air. It wasn't just what Eastwood had said, but how he had said it. There was no anger in his voice, no raised volume, no pointing finger, just a simple statement delivered with absolute conviction. In the audience, a young man named Steve Baker whispered to his girlfriend, "That's the most Clint Eastwood thing I've ever heard." Susan, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed quiet, allowing the impact of Eastwood's words to fully land. After several seconds, she turned to De Niro. "Robert, your thoughts?" De Niro took a deep breath. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that showed he was collecting his thoughts. The entire audience waited. That's a good line, Clint," he finally said, a small, reluctant smile appearing on his face. "I'd expect nothing less from you." There was a hint of tension still in his voice, but also something else. a grudging appreciation for the skill of Eastwood's response. After all, both men had built careers on powerful moments on screen. They could recognize a good line when they heard one. Susan, seeing an opportunity to explore this moment further, asked, "Clint, can you expand on what you mean by that? Are you suggesting that passionate advocacy is less effective than quieter actions?" Eastwood shifted slightly in his chair. "What I'm saying is that real conviction shows itself in how you live, not just in what you say. I've known many people who talk endlessly about what should be done, but do very little themselves. And I've known quiet folks who change the world without making a speech about it." In the front row, film critic Mary Johnson nodded slowly. She had interviewed both men many times over the years and knew that behind Eastwood's calm exterior was a man with strong principles who often donated to causes he believed in without publicity. De Niro seemed to be considering Eastwood's words carefully. When he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly. "I can't argue with the idea that actions matter more than words, but sometimes words are needed to inspire action. Sometimes you need to wake people up to what's happening around them." The audience was completely captivated now. What had started as an expected clash of opposing viewpoints was evolving into something more nuanced. A real conversation between two masters of their craft about the role of artists in society. Behind the scenes, producer Alan White was ecstatic. This was better than the simple confrontation he had hoped for. This had depth and substance while still providing the memorable moment that would be replayed on social media for days to come. Susan, sensing the shift in tone, asked both men, "Do you think there's room for both approaches in how artists engage with social issues?" Eastwood nodded slowly. "There always has been. Hollywood has always had its loud voices and its quiet ones. Both have their place." De Niro seemed to relax slightly. "I can respect that. We don't have to approach things the same way to be working towards some of the same goals." Susan looked at both men. "It seems like there might be more common ground between you two than people might have expected." Eastwood gave one of his rare smiles, just a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. "Robert and I have been around a long time. We've seen fashions come and go, politics change, but good storytelling remains." De Niro nodded in agreement. "That's true. Though I still think you're wrong about some things, Clint." This brought a laugh from the audience, breaking some of the tension in the room. Even Eastwood chuckled softly. Susan looked at her notes. "Speaking of storytelling, both of you have directed some of the most acclaimed films of the past few decades. I'd like to talk about your different approaches behind the camera." As Susan shifted the conversation to their work as directors, the energy in the room remained electric. Everyone there knew they had witnessed something special, a moment of genuine communication between two legends who saw the world very differently. But as the conversation continued, no one could forget Eastwood's line. It had changed the entire tone of the interview. With just 11 words delivered in his signature understated style, Clint Eastwood had reminded everyone of the quiet power that had made him an icon, and even his critic, Robert De Niro, had been forced to acknowledge the effectiveness of that power. As Susan prepared to lead them to another commercial break, viewers across America were already rewinding their recordings to hear Eastwood's line again. Within minutes, those words would begin spreading across social media, ensuring that this moment would live on long after the show ended. The moment the show went to commercial break, the studio erupted with excited chatter. People turned to their neighbors, repeating Eastwood's line to each other. Cell phones came out as audience members rushed to post about what they had just witnessed. Security guards at the back of the studio looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Even they had been caught up in the moment. On stage, makeup artists rushed forward to touch up both actors before the cameras returned. Susan Gray took a quick sip of water and reviewed her notes. She knew the rest of the show would now be viewed through the lens of that one powerful moment. In the production booth, producer Alan White was practically dancing. He grabbed his phone and called the network president. "Did you see that? Tell me you were watching." "I saw it," the voice on the other end confirmed. "It's already trending on social media. This is going to be huge for our ratings." Backstage, the crew members who weren't needed on set had gathered around the monitors. Debbie Clark, the production assistant, shook her head in amazement. You see De Niro's face? He didn't know what hit him. Her colleague, sound technician Mike Green, nodded. That's Eastwood for you. He always did more with less. Remember in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, how he barely had any lines? Meanwhile, across America, living rooms were buzzing with similar reactions. In Seattle, retired teacher George Williams and his wife Linda sat in amazement at what they had just witnessed. That's why Eastwood is Eastwood, George remarked to his wife. One line is all he needs. Linda nodded. De Niro is a great actor, but he met his match tonight. In Chicago, college students were gathered in a dorm common room to watch the show. When Eastwood delivered his line, the room erupted in a mixture of "oh" and applause. That needs to be on a t-shirt, said one student named Jeff. His friend Olivia was already typing on her phone. It's blowing up online already, look at this. She held up her phone to show a social media site where Eastwood's quote was being shared thousands of times per minute. Memes were already being created, placing the quote over images of Eastwood from his most famous roles. Back in the studio, the floor manager signaled that they would be returning from commercial in 30 seconds. Susan straightened her papers and looked at both men. That was quite a moment, gentlemen, she said quietly. Are you both okay to continue? Eastwood gave a small nod. De Niro, who had been deep in thought, looked up and said, Of course, it's just a conversation. But everyone knew it was much more than that. In just a few words, Eastwood had changed the entire dynamic between them. What had started as a tense confrontation had shifted into something more complex. There was still disagreement, but now there was also a certain respect that hadn't been there before. The floor manager counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, and pointed as the cameras went live again. Susan smiled at the camera. Welcome back to Celebrity Showdown. If you're just joining us, you missed quite a moment between our two guests, Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. We've been discussing the role of artists in political discourse, and things got rather interesting. The camera panned to show both men. Eastwood appeared completely at ease, as if nothing unusual had happened. De Niro looked more thoughtful now, less combative than before. Susan turned to face them both. Before the break, we were starting to talk about your work as directors. But I have to ask, Robert, has this conversation changed your perspective at all on how artists should engage with political issues? De Niro took a moment before answering. The studio was silent again, everyone eager to hear his response. Look, he began, I still believe strongly that artists have a responsibility to speak up about important issues. That hasn't changed. He paused, glancing briefly at Eastwood. But I can appreciate that there are different ways to make an impact. Clint has always let his work speak for itself, and that work has certainly had an influence on our culture. In the audience, Mary Johnson whispered to Frank Peters, Is he actually giving ground? I never thought I'd see that. Frank nodded. Eastwood's line hit home. De Niro is too smart not to recognize when someone has made a valid point. Susan nodded and turned to Eastwood. And Clint, has anything Robert said tonight resonated with you? Eastwood shifted slightly in his chair. His expression remained calm as always, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there at the start of the show. Robert is passionate about his beliefs. I can respect that, even when I don't agree with him. In a time when many people just repeat what they hear, at least he thinks for himself. It wasn't a huge concession, but coming from the normally reserved Eastwood, it felt significant. There was a murmur of appreciation from the audience. Susan sensed an opportunity to bring them together on more common ground. You both have had such amazing careers spanning many decades. What would you say to young actors today who are trying to find their voice both in their art and in how they engage with the world? De Niro leaned back in his chair, considering the question. I would say, be true to yourself. Don't be afraid to take stands on things that matter to you. But also make sure you've done the work. Make sure you know what you're talking about before you speak. Eastwood nodded slightly. I'd add that your work as an artist is what lasts. Politics change, fashions change, but if you tell true stories well, that lives on. There was a moment of genuine connection between the two men as they found this piece of common ground. The audience could feel it. Even Susan seemed touched by the moment. Backstage, Alan White turned to his assistant Betty Rogers. "Are you seeing this? This is even better than I hoped. The clash was great, but this has heart." On social media, the conversation was evolving as well. While many were still sharing Eastwood's crushing line, others were now commenting on the respect being shown between these two very different legends. One popular post read, "From clash to class. This is how adults with different views should talk to each other." Susan looked at her notes, then back at the two actors. "We only have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you both about something you have in common. You've both created iconic characters that have become part of American culture. Clint, from Dirty Harry to The Man with No Name, and Robert, from Travis Bickle to Jake LaMotta. What is it that draws you to these complex, often troubled characters?" As the conversation shifted to their craft, the tension from earlier completely faded. Both men became more animated as they discussed the work that had defined their careers. De Niro gesturing expressively as he talked about his process of becoming his characters. Eastwood more reserved but clearly engaged as he described his approach to bringing characters to life with minimal dialogue. The audience watched in fascination as these two giants of cinema found common ground in their love of storytelling, despite their different methods and beliefs. It was a masterclass in acting and directing, but also in how two very different people could connect through their shared passion. As the final minutes of the show approached, Susan asked one last question. "After tonight's conversation, would you two ever consider working together on a project?" There was a moment of silence as the two men looked at each other. The audience waited breathlessly for their answer. Eastwood gave one of his rare smiles. "Never say never. Might be interesting." De Niro nodded slowly. "I'd certainly consider it if the right script came along." The audience broke into applause. From a tense confrontation to a potential collaboration, no one could have predicted this outcome when the show began. As Susan began her closing remarks, people in the audience were already messaging friends and family who hadn't watched the show live. "You have to see this, it was amazing." Eastwood crushed De Niro with one line, but then something even more incredible happened. The morning after the Celebrity Showdown episode aired, the entertainment world was still buzzing about the exchange between Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. Breakfast television shows across the country played the clip of Eastwood's now famous line over and over. News websites featured headlines like "Eastwood's Quiet Thunder" and "The Line That Silenced De Niro." Entertainment reporter Kevin Foster appeared on Good Morning America with host Samantha Lee to discuss what everyone was calling the moment. "In all my years covering Hollywood, I've never seen anything quite like it," Kevin said as they replayed the clip. "It was the most authentic moment on television this year," Samantha nodded. "What made it so powerful, do you think?" "It was classic Eastwood," Kevin replied. Just like in his films, he let the other person talk, and then he came in with one perfect line that cut right to the heart of the matter. But what really surprised everyone was what happened afterward. How these two legends found common ground. In a coffee shop in Los Angeles, two film students watched the clip on a laptop for what must have been the 10th time. "That's how I want to direct," said one of them, a young woman named Tara. "Say more with less." Her friend Jack nodded. "But did you notice how De Niro handled it? He didn't get defensive. He actually listened. That's pretty rare these days." Meanwhile, in New York City, Robert De Niro was preparing for an appearance on Good Morning America. His publicist, a nervous young man named Daniel, was pacing the green room. "Are you sure you want to talk about this?" Daniel asked. "We could ask them to focus on your new film instead." De Niro shook his head. "No. People want to hear about what happened with Clint. It's fine." When De Niro walked onto the set, Samantha Lee welcomed him warmly. After a few minutes of small talk, she brought up the elephant in the room. "So, I have to ask about your appearance on Celebrity Showdown with Clint Eastwood," she said. "That moment has gone viral. How did it feel in the moment when he delivered that line?" De Niro smiled, showing remarkable grace. Clint has always had a way with words, he admitted. Sometimes fewer words say more. I respect that about him. Were you surprised by what he said? Samantha pressed. Not really, De Niro replied. That's who Clint is. He's always been a man of few words. What surprised me was how the conversation evolved after that. We found more common ground than I expected. Across the country in his home near Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood was having breakfast while his assistant Laura updated him on the reaction to the show. It's everywhere, Clint, she said, scrolling through her tablet. Everyone's talking about it. They're calling it a masterclass in communication. Eastwood merely nodded and continued eating his toast. He had never been one to dwell on public reaction to his words or actions. Jimmy Kimmel wants you on his show to talk about it, Laura continued. So does Stephen Colbert. And there's a call from Steven Spielberg. At this, Eastwood looked up. Spielberg? What does he want? He didn't say exactly. Just that he has an interesting project and wants to talk to you about it. 3 days after the show aired, photographers spotted Eastwood and De Niro having lunch together at Joe's Diner in Manhattan. The two men sat in a corner booth, deep in conversation and occasionally laughing. The photos, taken by freelance photographer Carol Evans, went viral immediately. Social media exploded with speculation. Were they discussing a project together? Had they become friends? Was this all a publicity stunt? Industry veteran and mutual friend of both actors, director Richard Peterson, was asked about the lunch during a red carpet event that weekend. Those two have always had more in common than people realize, he told reporters. They're both perfectionists. They both care deeply about their craft, and neither one suffers fools gladly. When pressed about whether the two were planning to work together, Peterson smiled. I couldn't say. But wouldn't that be something? 2 weeks after the show, Susan Gray gave an interview to The Hollywood Reporter about what was now being called the interview of the year. We knew bringing those two together would create some tension, she admitted. But we never expected it to become such a powerful moment. What was most remarkable to me was watching these two legends who have such different approaches to both art and politics find a way to respect each other. The interviewer asked if she thought the lunch meeting meant they were planning to work together. I have no inside information, Susan replied. But there was definitely a connection that formed by the end of our show. These are two of the greatest actors of their generation. The idea of them finally sharing the screen would be incredible. The buzz continued to build. Film critics wrote think pieces about the contrasting styles of Eastwood and De Niro, both as actors and directors. Political commentators used the exchange to talk about the possibility of finding common ground in divided times. 6 months after the famous interview, the entertainment world was stunned by an announcement from Paramount Pictures. Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro would co-star in a film for the first time in their long careers. The movie, titled Common Ground, would tell the story of two aging political rivals forced to work together in a crisis. Even more surprising, they would co-direct the project. At the press conference announcing the film, reporters eagerly asked about their famous television moment and whether it had led to this collaboration. Eastwood, true to form, kept his answer brief. Sometimes you need a little tension before the real conversation can begin. De Niro nodded in agreement and the room erupted in applause. A young reporter raised her hand. Can you tell us what it was about that moment that changed things between you two? De Niro looked at Eastwood before answering. I think what happened was authentic. In this business, in politics, there's a lot of performing. People saying what they think others want to hear. What happened between Clint and me was real. We disagreed strongly, but there was truth in it, Eastwood added, and respect. That's what's missing from a lot of conversation these days. As the press conference continued, film critic Mary Johnson leaned over to her colleague Frank Peters. Who would have thought that one of the most crushing lines on live TV would lead to this? Frank smiled. That's the thing about great actors. They know that the real drama isn't in the conflict. It's in what happens after. In living rooms across America, people who had watched the original confrontation now watched news reports about the upcoming film. The story of these two legends had resonated because it offered something rare, the possibility that people with deeply different views could not only clash, but also connect. As pre-production on Common Ground began, the original clip from Celebrity Showdown continued to be shown in film schools and communication classes as an example of how a few well-chosen words can change the entire conversation. Eastwood's line had indeed crushed De Niro in the moment. But what happened afterward, the respect, the listening, the finding of common ground, had changed much more than just the room. It had reminded everyone of the power of authentic communication in a world that badly needed it.